The winter of 1888 did not come to the Wyoming Territory with a gentle knock, it arrived like a judgment. For 3 days, the sky had been a bruised shade of iron gray, hanging low and heavy over the jagged peaks of the Tetons before finally breaking open. When the snow fell, it was not in soft, drifting flakes, but in hard, driving sheets that erased the horizon and turned the world into a blinding void of white. In the isolated settlement of Blackwood Crossing, the storm had driven every living soul indoors. The main thoroughfare was a river of ice and slush, the boardwalk slick and treacherous. Buildings huddled together against the gale, their windows glowing with the faint, yellow eyes of kerosene lamps, looking like ships lost on a frozen ocean. The wind howled through the gaps in the timber, a mournful sound that spoke of hunger and the kind of cold that could stop a man's heart in his chest. Garrett was a man who knew the cold better than most. He was a rancher who lived 20 miles north of nowhere, a man of few words and even fewer needs. He had ridden into Blackwood Crossing 2 days prior for supplies, intending to leave before the storm hit, but the weather had pinned him down. Now, with the wind easing slightly but the temperature plummeting, he knew he had to move. His cattle were fending for themselves in the high pasture, and guilt gnawed at him more fiercely than the frost. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the indistinct boarding house where he had waited out the worst of the blizzard. The air outside hit him like a physical blow, snapping the breath from his lungs. He adjusted the brim of his hat, pulling his heavy buffalo hide coat tighter around his frame. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and scarred by a life that hadn't given him anything for free. His face was weathered leather, his eyes the color of flint, usually narrowed against the sun or the wind. The town was silent. It was a ghost town of the living. The saloon was shuttered, the general store dark. Garrett's boots crunched loudly on the packed snow as he made his way toward the livery stable where his horse, a massive roan stallion, was quartered. He kept his head down, his mind already calculating the hours it would take to break a trail back to his homestead. He expected to see no one. In this weather, only fools and wolves were abroad. But as he passed the alleyway between the darkened bank and the smithy, a sound reached him. It was faint, barely audible over the whistling wind, but distinct enough to make him pause. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, human, female, and trembling with a desperation that cut through the ice. "Sir. Please." Garrett stopped. His hand instinctively brushed the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, a habit from the war, a habit from the trail, but he didn't draw. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the deep shadows where the snow had drifted high against the walls. At first, he saw nothing but the gloom. Then, a figure detached itself from the darkness. She stepped into the pale wash of moonlight that had managed to pierce the breaking clouds. Garrett felt a jolt of surprise that he kept carefully masked behind his stoic expression. She was not what he expected. In a land of wool, leather, and denim, she was a spectre of a different world. The woman was Chinese, her features sharp and delicate, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing, though it was disheveled now, wet with melted snow. But it was her clothing that arrested him. She wore a cheongsam, a traditional high-collared dress of silk that might have once been a vibrant crimson or gold, but was now faded to a dull, dirt-stained rust. It was tattered at the hem, torn in places that revealed layers of rags underneath, wrapped in a futile attempt to ward off the freezing temperature. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered, a sound like dry bones rattling. A thin, moth-eaten shawl was wrapped around her shoulders, offering about as much protection as a cobweb against a blizzard. She looked like she had been pushed to the very edge of the earth and was teetering, waiting for the wind to blow her off. "I am sorry to stop you," she said, her English accented but clear, her voice quivering as she fought to control her jaw. I have something to ask." Something no mother should ever have to say. Garrett didn't speak immediately. He looked at her hands, they were red and raw, clenched white at her sides. He looked at her eyes, they were dark pools of exhaustion, rimmed with the redness of weeping, yet holding a spark of fierce, terrifying determination. "You're freezing," Garrett said, his voice rough from disuse. "You shouldn't be out here." She shook her head frantically, stepping closer. The snow crunched beneath her thin, unsuitable shoes. "Please. Do not walk away." I have tried. I have tried the others. The shopkeep. The barkeep. They shouted. They told me to go. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. My daughter. She has not eaten for 3 days. Since the storm began. Garrett felt a twisting in his gut. He had seen hunger before. He had seen it in the prisoner camps during the war, seen it in the eyes of cattle during a drought. But hearing it from a mother standing in the snow in a silk dress that belonged in a palace or a summer garden, not a frozen frontier town, hit him with the force of a hammer. I cannot find work, she continued, the words spilling out faster now, as if she feared he would turn his back before she finished. The town. They will not hire a Chinese widow. They look at me with hate. Or worse, she took a ragged breath, her eyes locking onto his. Cowboy. Rancher. Please. Hire me for one night. Garrett stiffened. The phrase hung in the frozen air, heavy and loaded with implication. She saw his reaction and raised her hands quickly, palms out. No. Not. Not for what men usually want. Please, do not misunderstand. I have my dignity, even if I have nothing else. I mean work. Real work. I can clean. I can sew. I can cook. I can tend your horse. I can mend your gear. Anything. Any work you have. Please. 1 night's pay. Just enough for a warm meal for my child. Just enough to keep the cold from taking her. Garrett studied her. He looked for the deception, the trickery that life had taught him to expect. He saw none. He saw only a terrifying, raw honesty. She was proud, he could see it in the way she held her spine straight despite the tremors racking her body. She was begging, yes, but she was begging like a queen who had lost her kingdom, not a pauper who had never known worth. What is your name? Garrett asked, his voice softening slightly. My Lin, she whispered. My daughter is Gio. She braced herself for the refusal. She had heard it a dozen times in the last 24 hours. We don't want your kind here. Move along. No work for you. She expected him to laugh, or to proposition her, or to simply walk away into the night. Instead, Garrett sighed, a puff of white steam vanishing into the dark. He nodded toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Come with me. Both of you. Mylin blinked, snowflakes catching on her long lashes. You will hire me. I ain't the type of man to leave a child to starve, and I ain't the type to take advantage of a woman in distress, Garrett said firmly. I'll pay you for the work you mentioned. Fair wages. But first, we need to get out of this wind before you freeze to death right here on the street. She looked at him, searching his face for the cruelty she was used to. Finding only a grim seriousness, she nodded, a sob escaping her throat. She turned and ran back toward the shadowed alcove of the abandoned smithy. Garrett followed, his long strides eating up the distance. In the corner of the smithy's overhang, huddled behind a stack of rotting crates, was a bundle of rags. As Mylin approached, the bundle moved. A small face peeked out, pale as milk, with wide, terrified almond eyes. Mama, the child whispered. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. It is all right, Gio, Mylin said, kneeling in the snow and scooping the child into her arms. The girl was light, terrifyingly light, like a bird made of hollow bones. This man. He is going to help us. Garrett felt that twist in his chest tighten. He reached out and unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat. Before Mylin could protest, he draped it over her and the child. The coat was massive, swallowing them both, retaining the warmth of his body. Let's go, Garrett said. The livery is just there. The smith keeps a stove going in the tack room. They walked in silence, the strange trio, a towering rancher in a flannel shirt and vest, braving the biting cold, and a woman in a tattered silk cheongsam clutching a child, wrapped in a coat that smelled of tobacco, horses, and safety. Inside the livery stable, the air was still cold, but it was a dry, manageable cold, sheltered from the biting wind. The smell of hay and manure was thick and comforting. A lantern hung from a hook near the tack room, casting a warm, golden circle of light. Garrett guided them into the tack room. It was a small space, cluttered with bridles, saddles, and jars of hoof oil, but in the center sat a pot-bellied stove that radiated a dull, steady heat. He pointed to a wooden bench. "Sit," he commanded gently. Mai Lin sat, pulling Jio onto her lap. The little girl was shivering, her lips a pale shade of blue. Garrett didn't ask questions. He turned to his saddlebags, which he had left slung over a rail. He dug through them, his rough hand searching until he found what he needed: a packet of dried beef jerky, a tin of peaches he had bought as a luxury for Christmas, and a small loaf of bread he had purchased before the storm hit. He pulled a knife from his belt, the steel glinting in the lantern light. Mai Lin stiffened, pulling Jio closer, her eyes widening in sudden fear. Garrett noticed the movement and slowed his actions, flipping the knife casually to use the handle to crack the seal on the peach tin. "Easy," he rumbled. "Just opening dinner." He sliced the bread and the jerky, then handed the tin and the food to them. "Eat slowly, or you'll make yourselves sick." Jill looked at the food, then at her mother. Mai Lin nodded, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. The girl ate with a ravenous intensity, juice from the peaches running down her chin. Mai Lin watched her, taking only small bites of the bread herself, prioritizing the child even now. "Thank you," Mai Lin murmured, her voice thick with emotion. You do not know. You do not know what this means." "It's just food," Garrett said, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He watched them, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. "You said you wanted work." "Well, my saddle has a torn stirrup leather, and my coat, the one you're wearing, has a rip in the lining. If you can fix those, I'd say you earned your keep for the night." He didn't actually care about the stirrup or the lining. But he knew she needed to feel she wasn't taking charity. He saw the pride in her spine. Mai Lin nodded vigorously. "I will fix them. I will make them like new. And I will brush your horse. I know horses. My husband. He worked on the supply trains before the mines. We had horses." "Your husband?" Garrett asked. "Is he?" "He is gone," Mai Lin said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The coal mines in the territory. They are not kind places. There was a collapse 2 months ago. Many men died. He was one of them." She looked down at her hands. "After that, the company forced us out of the camp. They said the housing was for workers only. We traveled to the towns, but the exclusion laws, the anger. People do not want to see a Chinese woman unless she trailed off, unable to say the words. "Unless she's selling herself," Garrett finished for her, his voice grim. She nodded shamefully. "I would not do it. I would rather freeze." But when Jio stopped crying from hunger and just went silent, that is when I knew I had to beg. Garrett looked at the little girl, who had finished the peaches and was now leaning heavily against her mother, her eyes drooping. The warmth of the stove and the food were taking effect. "You're safe here tonight," Garrett said. "The hostler is a drunk, but he sleeps sound heavily. He won't bother you. I'll sleep in the loft. You two stay in here by the stove. Lock the door from the inside." Mai Lin looked at him, confusion warring with gratitude. "But the work? I must earn the money." "You can do the mending in the morning," Garrett said. "Rest now. You both look like you've walked halfway from China." He turned to leave, but stopped when she spoke again. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you help us, Mr. Garrett?" he said. Just Garrett. He paused, looking out into the darkened stable where the horses shifted in their stalls. "Because I've been cold, Mai Lin. And I've been hungry. And I know that nobody should have to sell their soul just to stay alive in a land with this much sky." He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, listening as the latch on the tack room door clicked shut. He lay back in the hay, pulling a spare horse blanket over himself, but sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside, thinking of the woman and child below, and the dangerous, hopeful thought that had taken root in his mind. Morning broke with a brilliance that blinded. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under 3 feet of pristine white powder. Sunlight shattered off the icicles hanging from the stable eaves. Garrett climbed down the ladder to find the tack room door open. Inside, the fire had been stoked. My Lin was already awake. She had found a needle and thread in his saddlebags, he always carried a repair kit, and was finishing the stitching on his heavy coat. She looked up as he entered. She looked different. The exhaustion was still there, etched around her eyes, but the terror had receded. She had tidied her hair, braiding it tightly back. Her cheongsam, though still tattered, had been brushed clean of mud and straw. "The stirrup is fixed," she said, pointing to the saddle resting on the stand. "And the coat is done. I also found some oil and treated the leather. It was dry." Garrett inspected the work. The stitching was microscopic, perfect, far better than anything he could have done. The leather of the saddle gleamed. "You have skilled hands," he said. "My mother taught me to embroider silk in Guangdong," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Leather is harder, but the needle is the same." Jiao was sitting on a pile of grain sacks, playing with a piece of string. She looked up at Garrett and gave a shy, tentative wave. He nodded back, feeling awkward but surprisingly warm. "The roads will be bad," Garrett said, "but I'm heading out. My ranch is a day's ride north, through the pass." My Lin's face fell. The reality of the morning crashed down on her. The night was over. The job was done. She stood up, handing him his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. For the food. For the warmth. I hope the work is worth the wage you promised." Garrett took the coat, but he didn't reach for his money pouch. Instead, he looked at her, then at the child. "You can't stay here," he said bluntly. "This town won't be any kinder today than it was yesterday. And that dress. No disrespect, but that silk is going to be your burial shroud if you stay out in this winter." My Lin wrapped her thin arms around herself. "We have nowhere else to go. We will try the next town." "The next town is 40 miles away," Garrett said. "You'll never make it." He took a deep breath. He was a man who valued his solitude. He liked the silence of his ranch. He liked his evenings undisturbed. But he looked at Jiao, and he saw the ghosts of children he hadn't been able to save during the war. He looked at My Lin, and saw a strength that matched the steel of the mountains. "Pack your things," he said. My Lin blinked. "Pack? We have nothing to pack." "Then get the girl," Garrett said. "I'm not leaving you here." "Where? Where are you taking us?" she asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. "My ranch," Garrett said. "But first, we're stopping at the Crossing Way station. It's run by an older couple, Thomas and Hattie. Good folks. They need help in the winters. Hattie's getting on in years and her joints give her trouble. She needs someone who can sew, cook, and help with the chores. Thomas needs a hand with the livestock." He wasn't lying, exactly. Thomas and Hattie were his nearest neighbors, 5 miles from his own cabin. They were like parents to him. But he also knew that he needed help at his own place. He just figured taking them to Hattie first was the proper thing to do, to give My Lin a sense of propriety and safety. You would take us there? You would vouch for us?" My Lin asked, stunned. "For a Chinese widow? I'd vouch for a hard worker," Garrett said. "Don't care where you're from. Care about what you do." He saddled the roan stallion, moving with practiced ease. He lifted Jiao up, placing her in front of the saddle horn. The little girl gasped, clutching the horse's mane, but Garrett's large hand steadied her. "Hold on tight, little one," he murmured. He turned to My Lin. She hesitated, looking at the high stirrup. Garrett laced his fingers together, offering her a step. She placed her small foot in his hands and he hoisted her up behind the saddle. She settled nervously, her hands hovering near his waist, unsure where to hold. "Best hold on to me," Garrett said, swinging himself up into the saddle. "The snow is deep, and roan can be skittish." She tentatively wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the heavy buffalo coat. She was so small, so fragile against his back, yet he could feel the tension in her muscles, the will to survive. They rode out of the stable and into the blinding white of the morning. The town was beginning to stir. A few faces appeared in windows. A man sweeping the boardwalk stopped and stared, spitting tobacco juice into the snow with a sneer. "Hey! Garrett," the man shouted. "What you doing hauling that baggage? You gone soft?" Garrett reined in the horse. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the man. He didn't say a word. He just stared, his hand resting casually near his hip. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. The man with the broom shifted uncomfortably, then looked away, suddenly finding a very interesting spot of ice to sweep. Garrett clicked his tongue, and the horse moved on. Mylin tightened her grip. "Ignore them," Garrett said over his shoulder. "Small minds in a big country." The journey was arduous. The snow was belly-deep on the horse in places. They moved slowly, the only sound the heavy breathing of the animal and the wind whistling through the pines. But for the first time in months, Garrett didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He felt the warmth of the child in front of him and the woman behind him. They stopped at midday near a frozen creek to rest the horse. Garrett cleared a patch of snow from a fallen log so they could sit. He shared the last of the jerky. "You said your husband was a railroad man?" Garrett asked, looking out at the white expanse. "Yes," Mylin said. "He came for the gold mountain, like so many. He found only iron and dynamite. He worked on the Central Pacific. He was a good man. He dreamed of a farm. A place where we could grow vegetables and raise deer in peace." "Sounds like a good dream," Garrett said. "Dreams are heavy things to carry when you are alone," she replied softly. "You aren't alone right now," Garrett said. The words hung in the air, surprising him as much as her. They reached the way station as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, turning the snow into a field of purple and gold. Smoke curled from the chimney of the sturdy log cabin. Thomas and Hattie came out onto the porch as Garrett rode up. They were old, their faces mapped with wrinkles, but their eyes were bright. Hattie wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes widening as she saw the passengers. "Garrett!" Thomas called out. "What in creation?" Garrett dismounted and helped Mylin and Gio down. The child was asleep, limp with exhaustion. "Thomas, Hattie," Garrett said, his voice firm. "This is Mylin and her daughter, Gio. They need work, and they need a place to stay. Mylin is the finest seamstress I've ever seen, and she's willing to work harder than any two men I know." Hattie looked at the Chinese woman in the tattered silk dress, shivering in the twilight. She looked at the sleeping child. Then she looked at Garrett, seeing the protective set of his jaw, the way he stood between the woman and the world. Hattie didn't ask about race. She didn't ask about history. She walked down the steps and wrapped a thick wool shawl around Mylin's shoulders. "Well, don't just stand there in the snow," Hattie scolded gently. "The stew is on, and it's getting cold. Bring the child inside." Mylin looked at Garrett, tears welling in her eyes again. You saved us." "No," Garrett said softly, echoing a thought he had felt earlier. "You saved yourself when you knocked on the door of that darkness and refused to let it take you." Weeks turned into a month. The winter held its grip, but inside the way station, and often at Garrett's ranch, there was warmth. Mylin proved to be everything she had promised and more. She mended every piece of cloth in Hattie's house. She cooked meals that transformed the bland frontier staples into feasts of flavor using herbs she found dried in the cellar. Gio began to gain weight, her cheeks filling out, her laughter becoming a sound that brightened the long, dark evenings. Garrett visited often. At first, he told himself it was to help Thomas with the heavy chores. Then, he admitted it was to check on them. Finally, he stopped lying to himself altogether. He came because he wanted to see her. One evening, Garrett found Mylin in the barn, brushing Roan. The horse, usually temperamental with strangers, stood perfectly still, his head lowered as she murmured to him in Cantonese. "He likes you," Garrett said, leaning against a stall door. Mylin jumped slightly, then smiled. She was wearing a simple calico dress Hattie had given her, but she had sewn a piece of the red silk from her old cheongsam onto the collar, a reminder of who she was. "He is a good horse," she said. "He just needs a gentle hand. Like his master." Garrett chuckled, looking down at his boots. "I've been called many things, Mylin. Gentle isn't usually one of them." She stepped closer to him, the lantern light dancing in her dark eyes. "Then people do not look close enough. I see you, Garrett. I see the man who stopped in the snow. I see the man who gave his coat to a stranger. I see the man who saved my jaw. I just did what was right," Garrett mumbled, the heat rising in his neck. "Many men know what is right," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "Few choose to do it." She reached out and took his hand. Her hand was small, rougher now from the ranch work, but warm. She placed it against her cheek. Garrett stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You have given us a life, Garrett," she whispered. "Maybe," Garrett said, his voice gravelly with emotion. "Maybe you gave me one too." He turned his hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. He didn't pull away. He didn't retreat to the solitude of his empty ranch house. He stayed. The wind howled outside, driving the snow against the barn walls, a reminder that the world was cold and unforgiving. But inside, in the circle of lantern light, the lone rancher and the widow stood together, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt the cold. Garrett realized then that he wasn't going to ride away anymore. Not from them. Not from this feeling. The winter would end, the snow would melt, and the spring would come. And when it did, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. The wandering days were over. He had found something worth staying for.